This is the Darshan Talks podcast. Regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. I am Major Hoffman. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com. Hey guys, my name is Major. I'm here with Darshan Kulkarni. Today we're discussing why are patients not joining your clinical trial. Last episode we discussed designing a recruitment strategy prior to the study initiation. And then we talked about identification of patients and patient groups and how to reach out to them to address lack of awareness. And today, we're going to be discussing complexity of study, the fear of the unknown, ability to discuss experiences, and demonstrating verifiably what impact they have. Darshan, kick it off with complexity of study. What do you mean by that?
So I think what it really comes down to is this idea that pharma companies and CROs are so used to dealing with studies and so used to the concept that these studies can be complicated, that they forget that for many of the subjects, this is their first, maybe only study that they have or will participate in. And there's a lot of fear. And that fear can make people go, I don't want to be part of the study. What becomes extremely important, and this is not necessarily even just to the patients themselves, but it may be for first-time investigators, study investigators, so the physicians themselves. It may be for the study staff. So what I think is really important as a CRO or as a sponsor is to make sure that you're considering the complexity of your study. Talk to the patients in your study. Understand what they are thinking about, what their concerns are. Number two, explain to them that what's actually going to happen to the patients in each part of that study. The informed consent form may help a little bit with that, but there's no avoiding an actual conversation. The informed consent form is a document that's used more as a legal document to say that someone was informed. But a conversation is what's critically important. Explaining to patients, understanding what may be necessary, maybe using videos, maybe using audio, explaining all of those pieces. And you know what would be really useful in that? Having other patients, having other subjects who may or may not be involved in the study, helping with that process. And that's actually one of the core pieces of patient centricity, which is understanding that the patient needs may be different. Now, one of the key things that comes up is, well, how do I know that these patients won't talk to each other, that these patients won't spoil my study? And there are ways to address that. And again, if you want to reach out, we can do a different podcast episode on that, or we can talk about that. But that's one of the big issues, right? Because patients are going online and they're trying to what some people are calling causing unblinding of the study, because they'll just go online and say, these are the symptoms I had. What symptoms did you have?
Well,
and if you have patients talk,
how would a company be able to tell if a patient went to a private Facebook group and would and begin discussing this? Would they be able? There's no way they'd be able to tell, is there?
There isn't a way to be able to tell, and that's what scares a lot of sponsors. Because it may not be on a private Facebook group. It may be on Twitter, and maybe it's too late by that time. Maybe it's a conversation that happened. And this idea that I need to be able to control these pieces is understandable, because it can be a huge problem as you're doing these studies. But if you don't engage and you don't help patients understand what's happening to them, then they're going to try to figure out ways to help themselves.
Right. And
so
what you were saying,
solution. Go ahead.
And what you were saying is the actual process of methods to track and make sure that this information isn't really discussed outside. That's that. If we were to go down that track, that's opening Pandora's box.
Correct.
So we're going to have that in a different episode.
We'll do it as a different episode. But the key piece again is recognizing that patients have needs. Don't think of patients as they're just the people in your study. Think of them as having independent and unique needs that need to be met. And they have concerns, they have fears, and sometimes a more rigorously designed informed consent form that isn't 9 pages long, that isn't 20 pages long, may be part of the answer. But sometimes having patients like themselves explain it to them. So maybe these new patients are not part of the study, or maybe they were part of a different study. That might be one of the considerations you have. Having an actual conversation with the study staff, so whether it's the physicians, whether it's the nursing staff, and explaining what actually happens during the study. That might happen during a study initiation visit, but it's routine to find out that the study initiation visit didn't take in the way that they wanted them to happen. So it's important that that conversation about the complexity of the study, why the study was designed in the way it was designed, all happen.
So
that would be number one.
The informed consent, it exists as an indicator that a conversation took place. It's not an actual conversation. You have to have that conversation for the informed consent to actually mean something.
Exactly.
What is actually a fear that a patient would have in a clinical trial?
So it might be as simple as, what's going to happen to me? So it may be as simple as, what is the likelihood that I'm going to have any of these adverse symptoms? Because the informed consent form will say things like, your liver may fail, and your hair may fall out, and your fingernails aren't going to keep growing. Those are scary things. And as a clinician or as a member of the study staff, you may go, the likelihood of that happening is incredibly remote. That is true, but that was not understood by the patient. The patient may go, does this mean I have no other chances? And maybe another patient will go, no, that's not what this means. This is just another opportunity for us to learn more. Having someone who's been through the process means a lot to a patient. And this may be part of that conversation. Explain the complexity, explaining the nuances, explaining how it applies to the patient themselves. So those conversations, having a support group, if you will, is useful. But obviously that support group needs to be managed. Because if you don't manage in the right way, they will go off and talk to each other and go, here's what I'm feeling. Are you feeling this, or is this part of the study, or am I just feeling lousy? And if you don't have someone that they can talk to, that's bound to happen. Wouldn't it happen to you if you were part of a study? So that would be something to think about.
Okay.
So that takes us to the second piece, right? So it's the first one was the complexity of the study. The second one was the fear of the unknown. And the types of conversations we want to have is talking to them about what could happen. Is it the side effects? The side effects themselves, maybe if that's part of the informed consent form, that's explaining what could happen. But the second piece that goes with it, and I hinted at this a few seconds ago, is this idea that the likelihood of the side effects of them happening to you would be a second piece. So having someone explain that, yes, it's theoretically possible that your hair may fall off. But we've seen this in an extremely rare list of people. And if that does happen to you, maybe you should come talk to us so that we can figure out if this is still the right study for you. Or maybe we'll find out that it is, and this is just transient. But we can have that conversation, making them feel like you are within that process with them. This is not they're a study animal being used for anything. It is a partnership in many ways, isn't it? And then comes the next piece of what is actually going to happen, how often a blood draw is going to happen, how often our blood pressure is going to happen, how often do I need to come back? Is this something that will work with my lifestyle? That becomes another piece. This becomes extremely important, for example, in phase 1 studies, because in phase 1 studies, these are healthy people. And you're now telling healthy people, I want to do blood draws, I want to put things that have never been put into a human being into you, and seeing what happens. It becomes very important in saying and again, we can keep going down this path, but right. The key piece is talk to your patients. Maybe use study staff, maybe use patients to help communicate these conversations.
So here's a question for you. What's a really good way to just keep a patient, or to keep reminding a patient about subsequent visits? How often should someone reach out? Should they reach out? Is that just part of the clinical trial itself in terms of you have to come back, maybe like once every 2 weeks for a blood draw. How do you remind them and make sure they're on track on the schedule?
So again, what many study groups will do is they might have a nurse who will reach out to them and remind them that, oh, don't forget we have a meeting, or you have to come back to the office in a couple of days. We have you at 10 a.m. on Thursday.
And it's important to note that you said nurse, not newsletter.
Actually, newsletters are also used.
Okay.
And as are a variety of different things. So it could be a phone, it could be a newsletter, it could be, and maybe it's all of them. It doesn't have to be one or the other, right? Because people will receive information differently. I
guess it would be just contextual, right? So if it's something that's really personal, I would prefer maybe a person reach out to me. But if it's something where, it's not super personal, it's just a quick touch and go, maybe a newsletter would be better, like an email.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the point. Email might be a third one, and maybe you create a private Slack board and do it on Slack. I mean, there are so many different mechanisms that are available now, and then maybe it is using forums to actually talk to patients and saying, look, we've now finished phase 1 of this process. We're now going to be participating in phase 2. Here's what to expect. Come join our private Facebook group, and only certain people will be allowed to be part of that private Facebook group. Mm-hmm. Or it might, and again, you've got to be careful, because depending on how you do it, you may have to worry about HIPAA concerns, and you may need to worry about other privacy concerns. If you're international, you've got GDPR issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But again, as concepts, what you need to be thinking about is, how do you engage these patients? And remember, note the use of the term, and this is a frequent source of concern within the clinical trial world. Are these patients or are they subjects? And the reason it matters is because if they are patients, they have a reasonable expectation of being cured. That's why they're part of something. If they are subjects, they understand that we're not trying to cure you, we're trying to test something. And that becomes a key piece. Either way, they're still human, and they still deserve the right to understand what's happening to them. And that becomes a key piece of things. So,
that's interesting.
One of the
so
things,
patients have an expectation of being cured, and subjects are being tested for an end goal.
Correct. They're part of something bigger where there's an end goal. So that becomes interesting as you continue. So one of the things I invented was something called Podium. And again, I'm happy to talk to you about that. But it's essentially a wiki-like format where patients can communicate with each other for specific goals. And again, if there's an interest in that, I'm happy to talk about that as well. But the key piece being, you need to provide a forum for patients to engage with each other. It may be in the context of writing documents, and we can talk about that as the next piece, and explaining to patients on what impact they've had. But that's going to be the next piece. Major, do you want to?
Yeah, sure.
So
we're actually addressing the concern of why patients are not joining your clinical trial. In the previous episode, we discussed designing a recruitment strategy prior to the initiation of the study. Have a distinct recruitment strategy. Then we discussed identification of the patients and patient groups and how to reach out to them, and then creating an awareness campaign to address the lack of awareness that they may just not know about your clinical trial and what you're working towards. And today, in this episode, we discussed the complexity of the study. Then we discussed the patient's fear of the unknown, how to combat that, different types of conversations we should have, and the difference between a patient and a subject, which I thought was pretty interesting. And also the ability of those patients or subjects to discuss the experiences. And as Darshan had explained, there is a platform that he took part in founding and creating called Podium. That's a Synchrogenics product, I think. Darshan, is that correct?
Yes.
And I think next episode we'll be discussing demonstrating the verifiability.
Well, the last point is demonstrating verifiably what actually.
Verifiably.
So
that's not a word you say every day.
Well, so as lawyers, we're told to make up words. So
Okay.
that's part of my making up words. But I think the key piece is patients want to know that they had an impact, right? So they're literally giving their blood, sweat, and tears in many cases to be part of these studies, and they want to know what happened to it. They want to know what the result of the study was. Okay. And putting something on clinicaltrials.gov doesn't necessarily give those answers. And what may be important is what Europe is doing, what the EMA is doing, which is they're saying that if you are a patient and you participated in a clinical study, you have the right to know what happened in that clinical study. So if you're going to take a patient's information and put it onto clinicaltrials.gov, put it into JAMA, put it into New England Journal of Medicine, put it into The Lancet, what you have to be able to do is also take that same complex language and make it understandable to patients. So they are asking for what's called lay language summaries, plain language summaries, what are also called lay summaries. And they're saying, explain it to patients, explain what happened to patients in language that they will understand. And again, if you guys have questions on how that happens and how to make that happen, a lot of large and small patient pharmaceutical companies are doing it. This is required in Europe in many cases. Canada is trying to get into this as well. The US is coming at it more from a patient-centric viewpoint, less from a regulatory viewpoint, but it's kind of critically important because it closes that loop that patients participate in. Right now, it's very much give me data and nothing from the pharmaceutical company back to patients. And this is closing that loop, going from the idea of give me data to let me tell you what happened with the data. So whether it's lay summaries, whether it's giving raw data back to patients. So that's our goal. That's us explaining why patients are not joining your clinical studies.
So we're actually not going to have another episode on this. This is just going to be a 2-episode split right down the middle.
Yep.
Thank you for listening to the Darshan Talks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. I am Major Hoffman. If you have any questions for Darshan, reach out via Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.